Hey everybody, this is Ron Taylor with the Roughcut Overview. Today we're on Romans chapter 3, and there's some things in here that you may or may not have seen. I'm going to pull the scope back just a little bit and maybe give you a wider angle, some things maybe you didn't consider. Take a look at how these things actually do literally apply to our lives when the rubber meets the road. Right off the bat, verses 1 through 4, we see Paul's laying the case that God is faithful. But a crucial point here is that our unfaithfulness doesn't cancel his faithfulness. That is a huge deal when you think about life this side of the cross and everything he paid for and everything he supplied. And God is saying, in your faithlessness, I'm still faithful. So that's a huge thing. And what does it mean that he's faithful? He keeps his word, and we can't stop him from keeping his word. And so the Jewish question comes up. If everything we do highlights his love, whether we're in agreement with the law or if we are rejecting the law and we're living a life of disobedience toward God, he somehow takes that disobedience and turns it to his glory, which is what he does. Then the question is, well, why shouldn't we just proceed in riotous living? Why wouldn't we just want to embrace that and let evil come out of the seed, or let good come out of the seed of evil? Well, Paul says, first of all, that's not how things work. Evil may seem to magnify God, but it's God stepping in his good, overcoming that evil that causes things to look like evil is magnified and making him look bigger. It's because of who he is and his nature overcoming that evil. So, and then the question is asked, so how can he judge the world then? And why not just do evil so the good may come, like I said. And Paul, I love the statement Paul makes. He says, people are slanderously reporting that this is what we teach. He referred to it as slander. But the question I want to ask is, what kind of grace message do you think Paul was teaching and Paul was proclaiming that people were saying of him slanderously? He's teaching that you can do whatever you want and there's no consequences and God will be glorified. You can't be preaching a narrow grace and proclaiming it publicly and loudly and have that accusation brought to you, have that accusation made about you. Paul understood the grace of God in a very deep way. He saw very abounding power coming out of the grace of God that overcomes sin, overcome all of the failure of humanity, and once for all eradicated its effect eternally and temporally. Provision is made so that we can live outside of the operations of sin and death. Provision has been made so we don't have to deal with that forever, and we don't have to put up with it now. But Paul's critics said, oh, he's teaching that you can do whatever you want. And again, I want you to think about this. What kind of message was he preaching? What was he saying about the grace of God that made people draw that erroneous conclusion and begin to slander him over it? Think about that. Think about how wide the grace is. In fact, I challenge you, get you a copy of the Amplified Classic or look it up on the Bible app and see if you can find any references in the New Testament to a lacking grace or a barely enough grace or a short of grace. No, you're not going to be able to find any, because they're all references to an abundant grace of God, more than enough. And your worst days and your worst decisions could never exhaust the grace of God. The blood of Jesus is far more eternally more powerful than your ability to fail and your ability to mess things up, and far more, eternally far more powerful than Adam's ability to mess things up. He's so overwhelmed what Adam did and what Satan did in Adam that there's no comparison, he says later. There's no comparison. So I need to keep that in mind. And then he talks about these lawbreakers. He says in verse 9, he says that their mouths are open sepulchers, and they're spewing out all these terrible things. Verses 9 through 18. It's like looking at a weed. You see, well, say the weed is irritating. It's got those green sprouts, and it doesn't really do anything. It just takes up space and takes up nutrients from the soil, but doesn't give anything back. It just, it's kind of like that in the sense that he's starting from the external. He says they're loud, they're saying terrible things. And he, in a verse, getting close to verse 18, verse 17 and 18, he says, look, misery is all over them. Like, they're miserable people. And their ways are completely devoid of peace. They have no peace. They're living their lives in a terrible destruction that is rooted in no reverential fear of God in their eyes. He says, now, the law says the law was presented to Israel so that every mouth would be hushed and all the world would be held accountable to God. The law illustrates that it is impossible for mankind to strive into the righteousness of God or work his way into it. And that's what a lot of the Jewish reaction to the law was. Oh, I got to work. I got to climb these 613 steps and I'll be there. I'll be there. Well, the thing about the law, and he touches this in he touches this in Galatians quite firmly. You don't reach completion of the 613 commandments and go, oh, I'm finished. If you're attempting righteousness by the law, you can never let go of one of those 613 commandments. You are locked into a perfection requirement of you, and nobody can do that. No one can do that. No one can do that on their own. It's Jesus, the life of Christ on the inside of us, that ever helps us to attain the spirit of the law, which is to love each other, love our neighbors as ourselves, love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's only through Jesus Christ that these things can happen. So he's bringing up the case. He's making this case where, these Jews, they had the law, they had the instruction manual, if you were, didn't accomplish what they needed to accomplish, could not attain to that level of righteousness. But he's saying Jesus Christ, faith in him, in verses 20 through 26, faith in Jesus Christ is the doorway to righteousness. It's righteousness by faith. And he says, look, it's attested by the law and the prophets. This is what they were talking about when they said the just will live by faith. And back, the just will live by faith. We live and we move and we have our being all by faith in Jesus Christ, by the faith of Jesus Christ. That his faith in us and through us causes us to live a life that reflects the righteousness that we already have. Righteousness is a free gift. It's not something we have to earn. It's not something we strive for. We don't get measures of it. We don't grow in righteousness. We don't diminish in righteousness. We have the righteousness of God himself. We also have the choice to live out of that righteousness by faith, or we can get into a striving to try to prove that we're worthy of this righteousness, or we can totally disregard it. But it has no effect on how we stand before God. It has an effect on how we stand before ourselves, and it has an effect on how we see God himself, who is love. But it cannot ever, evil will never be able to dictate God's response. God will always respond in love because he is love. And that love has formed and established righteousness by faith. And it is attested to by the law and the prophets. There is nothing higher, righteously speaking, than receiving by faith, because that is the only way we could ever be righteous. Your conduct is either going to reflect Adam or it's either going to reflect Jesus, but your relationship with God is secure. All right. And verses 27 through 31, Paul makes the point, there's no room for boasting here. You didn't earn it. You can't take credit for it. It's a God thing. You just receive it and you live out of it and walk in it. We'll see you next time.